Welcome to the Rebuild Procurement Podcast, where we dive deep into topics to keep procurement people up to date and ahead of their peers. On today's episode, Alan, we're going to go through Broadcom's price hikes on VMware. This is one that might be affecting certain folks, so we'll dive a little into that. You've had some conversations with folks in the industry, CPO specifically, go through some of those conversations. Have to touch on DOGE. It's the center of the universe right now when it comes to procurement. And then we'll give some of our own backgrounds and early days of our careers. So let's get into it. All right, I'm Tom Finn, bringing 15 years on the client side, procurement, finance, and category management experience in large and small cap orgs.
And I'm Alan Veek, a procurement geek on the sell side of our procurement street, and I've assembled a team of superhuman procurement professionals doing managed services at a company that we call Summit.
All right, Alan. So first one we have here is some news. I think I saw this the latter part of last week, so like Thursday, Friday, on Broadcom's price hikes on VMware. So just as some background, I don't know if folks, VMware is kind of like, it provides safety for your internal networks and a lot of that cyberware. They're the ones trying to guard your company from that. So a lot of folks have contracts with VMware. Firstly, before I get into what they're doing, I think it might be nice and helpful to give some background on VMware, because they have quite a story. They've been acquired and bought, sold off. They were started in '98, so pre-.com boom, and were acquired by EMC just over $500 million, so $625 million in cash by EMC, and then they were spun off again 3 years later, until more or less they were acquired by Dell in 2016. And from there, they were spun off again as an independent company. So folks trying to bring them in, realizing they're not the right fit, spin them back out. But in 2022, they were acquired, think of this, $61 billion.
Boy, that's
69 total, assuming debt. And so, which is a hefty price tag to pay by any company. So you really have to, whenever there's those dollars, there's expectation either they're at or they're going to build into that. So so they ended up, Broadcom, they spun it off 2 years, I guess a year later, a piece of it to KKR. But essentially where they're at now, Broadcom, the piece that Broadcom retained, which was seemingly majority, they have they're now increasing pricing. And it's not necessarily increasing pricing. The way I was reading the article was they're changing from one type of licensing model to another licensing model, and it's causing dramatic increases to their customers, and they're churning. So what that means is the purchase that Broadcom made, you have all these customers that are enterprise customers. They're kind of saying, F off, I don't need you anymore. I'll find somebody else. There's alternatives. And that's where that's going for Broadcom. And thinking through that, just as folks deal with, as they deal with their maybe main suppliers or major suppliers like a VMware, a lot of times there's this consolidation, not a lot of times, but it's often that there's consolidation within industries. And this goes from, software to folks in the field. There's a lot of this consolidation that's happening from the private equity companies of the world. And there's two strategies generally. I think you've kind of dealt with this before, Alan, but there's one where it's, let me buy it, let me cut folks, cut jobs, reduce some of the air quotes bloat and overhead, and then I'll make more money, I'll make more margin on that, and then I can spend it off for certain dollars later. Or I buy that company, increase prices, and I make more money that way. And that's kind of the way that seemingly Broadcom has approached to VMware's. But you kind of have to be ahead of that. So anytime you see an acquisition that's happening of one of your major suppliers, if you want to get into a longer term contract, it might not be a bad idea then, but you could expect one or the other. One, your service level is probably going to drop or two, your price is going to go up. What are your thoughts on that, Alan?
Yeah, well, it's I've got lots of thoughts as usual. The first thought is kind of a fun one. I remember, so I was working during the first .com bust, and I remember VMware was the high flyer. The promise was with this client, you could just have a stupid. You didn't even have to have a powerful laptop because laptops actually still cost a lot of money. They were a new thing then. You just had to have a thin terminal, and VMware would produce for you a desktop that looked and felt just like you were sitting at your desk in your office. And the promise was to drive down IT costs dramatically. So it's a lot of fun talking about how this is driving up IT costs dramatically with this latest price increase. Yeah, it strikes me that this is a fairly classic application of the tipping point where you can take little small cuts, you can take little small straws, but there is that one straw that's going to break the camel's back. It doesn't feel like this was a small cut. It felt like with this pricing model change, the prices ramped pretty dramatically. And maybe they thought because we've pushed through price increases annually forever, this is just going to be the same way, but now they're getting a bit of a backlash. So it feels like a classic tipping point to me, where maybe enough people are raising their hand and saying, okay, switching costs were hard, but now switching costs make sense. We've just got to do the hard work of doing some difficult, not just sourcing and good procurement work, but we need to do the hard work of actually switching and affecting the organization. So number one thought was it's kind of like this classic tipping point. Number two is I like what you said, Tom. I think you nailed it perfectly, which is when you see this coming down the road, probably one of your best bets is to try to lock in, grandfather in long-term pricing. Maybe a 3, a 5, a 7-year deal with something like this. But then I think if you put on your category manager hat, what you have to do is you have to say, okay, I get to take a little bit of a break for 3 or 5 or 7 years because I'm signing a long-term contract with this huge provider. But what you should be saying is just like a classic balance sheet. On the other side of the ledger from that 3 to 5 to 7 year break you get to take, you've got to start putting in some time. You've got a liability. You've got to start putting in some time as a category manager saying, boy, there is going to be a switch that we need to investigate 3 or 5 or 7 years from now when this contract does end. And that is a heavy lift. So you need to start doing that work early, I think. And I have a related story to this that I'd like to share because I talked to a lot of chief procurement officers, especially in the financial services industry. I had a really good conversation about 9 months ago with a CPO at a top 10 U.S. bank. And basically this guy, I've never seen a guy look more defeated. He was clearly like in the throes of some big problem. And he basically, what he said to me, I wrote down, so I'm just going to read it directly. He said, there is a real margin shifting that is happening between the financial services industry, where he lived, and software companies. So let me say that again. There's a real margin shifting that's happening between financial services industry and the software industry. And that struck me, and I was like, what in the world does he mean by that? And I had to sit and think about it for a while. But basically, I worked for a software company for about 6 years, and they have such the world of SaaS, software as a service. They have such good pricing models, such good pricing discipline. They've got high margins, but they're very disciplined about the way that they keep their pricing very good for the company. And I think basically what the CPO was saying is once you get locked in, once your organization locks into a software like VMware, it's so hard to switch that you're now held prisoner by that software company. And they can just pretty much raise price anytime they want to raise price because they know that the only way you can say no to them on a price increase is by switching or threatening to switch. And that's so hard to do with some of these largest software packages.
Yeah. And some strategies for being ahead of that, because a lot of them, they all have their moat, and it's not necessarily whether or not to your point, Alan, whether or not that area is commoditized or not. It's that, okay, I spend $1 million on something, but it's going to probably cost me like at least 500,000, if not $1 million to switch. So is it worth the switch to a company that's going to be 800K?
Yeah.
Probably not, right? Like it's tough because that's 5 years, to get a return. Definitely when companies start getting in the gouging mode, like which is what I think is coming across to clients. I don't work with Broadcom. Um, I have not worked with them, but if their approach is to like, let's start changing. I have worked with companies where they try and change like call it like a seat to whatever other type of
Yes.
model.
Yes.
That's the supplier needs to be cognizant of what that looks like. Clearly, whoever is their CRO, maybe he or she didn't have that, the ear to the ground from the feedback they're getting from customers, or maybe they just didn't care and they had a KPI to hit. But
That's what
just
it
to,
was, for
yeah,
sure.
I know, yeah,
No
it's
question.
always is what it is, right?
They knew completely what this pricing model change was going to mean for them. Trust me,
Yeah,
they modeled it 10 ways to Sunday.
yeah, read, measure what matters, John Doerr.
Yep. Yep.
That ends up being exactly what happens. But ways to get ahead of it: alignment with your business stakeholder, the one that in this case that would be using the VMware, Broadcom, whatever it may be. Just get on the same page as them, understand where it's good, where it's bad. So you start sharing you could tell the good feedback of how it works, but also the bad. Service has not been great, things of that nature. That's one positioning. Knowing the alternatives and where they're priced at. If there's up and coming companies, they don't mind. Everyone minds a little bit to have to build out pricing for you. But a lot of software companies understand there's 2 to 3 years to get into larger companies.
Mm-hmm.
And they understand they might not get it right now, but they want to be in the conversation for when you do a formal look at something. So they'll provide you pricing. So be clear that you're not making a switch right now, but let them know that there could be future opportunity and you'd like to understand how their pricing works. That'll also position you well. And then the third would just be if you're going to do some sort of bid or real analysis, you got to do it. If it's one of these like an ERP or something like VMware, you got to start a year out because
Yeah.
the build out and the move, you want to give folks 6 months, ERP even more. But you really have to have these upfront conversations, and it has to be in a strategic mindset and led that way.
Yeah, I agree. I would also say timing is hugely important, not just giving yourself a year's runway, but also figuring out that you're going to sign a deal at the end of a quarter, at the end of a calendar year, at the end of a fiscal year, when you're going to be able to have a lot of leverage with that with that one particular software provider.
Yeah, if their fiscal year is January or February, perfect. Make the contract expire then, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
because it does
Exactly.
matter. They have year end goals to hit, and work with your salesperson too. Hey, where do you need to, like, what are you looking to hit here? Like, obviously we want to pay less. We don't want increases. Like, how do we work together? A lot of salespeople, they're being measured too. And if you're a decently sized client,
They're
they're not
all
trying to
being
lose you
measured.
because that looks really bad for them. Understand that.
Oh yeah,
That looks really
yeah.
bad. Production of
The,
licenses,
the
they don't want to see that. They
yeah
look
the
bad
churn
internally.
churn is the number one metric that software companies work off of. So yeah, churn is everything to them. Churn being, I think, formally defined as loss of customer. But it's a metric that says how many new seats do we have versus seats lost or something along those lines.
Yeah.
It's a formal metric in the software world. And the nice thing about timing your the finalization of your negotiation, the signing of a contract, right around the time that their fiscal year ends, is keep in mind most software companies have in the neighborhood of 85% margin. That's a lot to play with. They are happy to shave 5-10 points off of that in order to hit targets, hit goals for Wall Street, whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm. So work with the salesperson too to understand what they're shooting for because it very well could benefit you. So ask those
Yes.
questions for bigger contracts, have ongoing dialogue. So it's not just a procurement person walking in at the last minute asking for less money. You can build it to be even much better for your organization just by having earlier conversations.
Yeah, that's right. And there was a related tweet that I saw last night, Tom, you know, related to this notion of IT spend, IT budget. This is another piece from our friends over at DOGE, Department of Governmental Efficiency. The tweet said the federal government spends 80% of its annual $100 billion IT budget on maintaining outdated systems. So just think about that. I mean,
Sounds like
we
McDonald's and their ice cream machines.
yeah, that's a thing.
Yeah,
That's
I
a
know.
real thing. And some people think it's on purpose. Well, we know that this spending happening in the government is undoubtedly on purpose. It's a lack of willingness to switch, which we just talked about.
Which is human nature, right? Like switch
human nature.
hurts too, right?
It does. It's hard to do. Yeah, it involves work, right? It's much easier just to stick on the system that you've been on for 30 years, even though it runs on a green screen. There once was a company that I almost joined that their whole like $100 million of revenue that they had was due to the fact that they took old systems that supported the insurance industry and they cranked them over into the new system. It was the same old software, but they were able to get it to work on the new machines. I was like, $100 million in revenue just to do that, to like keep old decrepit software running. It's quite an amazing thing. So I know that the pain that the federal government feels having to spend $100 billion or 80 billion of $100 billion on old systems. There's a guy who he's a bit legend in our neighborhood. He lives around the corner and he has absolutely
great Christmas lights as well, or what is that?
Well, you don't even like
it's tough to be a legend in a neighborhood. I don't know if I'd ever want to be a legend in a neighborhood.
No, because when we have visitors over, we drive by and we say, look at this, and they're like, that's a castle. We're like, yeah, that's a castle. It's the castle in our neighborhood. It's such a castle that the rumor has it. So this guy's doing a little time because he did some tax evasion, building this monster castle, monster house. Rumor has it that he got busted when FBI agents were just kind of like personally doing some personal travel, and they were flying into Pittsburgh, and the plane flew over his house. They're like, what is that? And they started doing some digging, and sure enough, tax evasion. But this guy is legend because, everybody says, what did this guy do to make all that money? And by the way, it's just he and his wife living in this house. Crazy. It has like 45 bedrooms.
Oh my gosh.
The story goes that
Can I guess? Can I guess though?
Oh, give it a please.
So
give it a
tax
shot.
evasion. So well, it's not insurance. Was he in the insurance industry?
No.
Okay.
It ties to our story because basically 30 years ago, this guy created the software that allows the Social Security Administration to print all of their checks. They still use it today. It's still duct tape, baling wire held together. And apparently the contract that he signed with the government was a long-term contract that said, I get like 1 cent for every check that you cut.
Oh, wow.
And and so talk about a pricing model. And so that led to this monster castle in my neighborhood. Crazy.
Is he still behind bars, or did he move?
About to go behind bars. Yeah, he's about to go behind bars. He's not a young man, which is kind of sad. So he's going to be behind bars as an old man. His son was behind bars for real estate fraud. It's like,
they're all about like cutting corners at a minimum.
I live in a tough neighborhood.
Yeah, I guess that's the possible downside of taking advantage of the government on the back end. You can get 30 years of good, but then when they realize they got screwed, you're getting come after.
Oh my gosh. So so that's so I have some small personal experience with this notion of outdated software that the government is spending gobs and gobs of money to maintain.
Yeah. For the change, and this is in organizations too, it does take a person that's like a change agent, someone that's willing to like step up and say this isn't good, but then also receptive leadership. I feel like that we've said it before, but you couldn't go wrong buying IBM, whatever the term was for that, right? Yeah. You can't get fired.
Nobody got fired. Yeah,
exactly.
That's right. Nobody gets fired for buying IBM.
Until
IBM is 10x the next closest solution, the better solution, right?
Then you got to find something else. Mm-hmm. But the government kind of has fallen into that seemingly, right? Like they probably just like maintained. If you're just status quo, you can kind of shrug your shoulders, say, "Hey, I was just supporting the system." They haven't really had probably the opportunity. I'd expect that there's going to be a decent number of folks internally within the government. They're going to be like, "This is my time." Like, geez, have I been waiting for this? I worked with somebody that
Yes.
was she was in the procurement space within the government before, or we knew each other well, let's say, and she would just tell me how like things how they function differently within the government. Um, and I was just always surprised, right? Like she was coming into the I've always worked in private public companies, and there you're kind of always expected to save money, and she was fantastic as a person and as a worker as well. Um, but it was one of those things. I mean, I bet if she was in there right now, uh, she'd be totally ready to speak up once she felt comfortable. But I'd imagine most people today even still probably feel a little uncomfortable. So I think that'll be pretty cool
Yep.
for a lot of folks. I bet there's a lot of folks that are excited internally about like doing good work and changing things that they've had kind of been stuck with for a bunch of years.
I think you're right. And it does, I don't know if you have this same sense, Tom, but I've been amazed over the course of the last few weeks. It does feel like it's since the election that there, again, speaking of tipping points, it feels like there's another tipping point. People willing to kind of come out and start talking. I think it kind of finally hit home when I saw that Mark Andreessen interview on Joe Rogan,
Oh, did you watch
where,
that?
yeah, that was quite interesting and,
Yeah.
quite revealing. Some of the things he said, you're like, wow, I didn't know all this stuff was going on.
Yeah, he was
But
like, I'm
but
gonna catch crap
it
for this.
yeah, but he didn't seem to care. And when after he came and said his piece, then out of the woodworks come 100 other people who are like, yeah, it's true, and let me tell you my story.
Oh, really? I haven't
And
seen any of the follow on to that, but I did
oh
listen to
yeah,
him.
there's lots. It does. So again, it feels like we hit a little bit of a tipping point where, like under the old Soviet Union, you weren't allowed to talk about things, but then at some point in time, people just started talking about things, and then everyone starts talking about things.
Yeah, once it becomes
It
okay
feels
and you
like
can't
we've hit
be
a tipping point.
persecuted on your own, then
Yeah.
yeah,
Yep.
let's chat.
Yes,
The
that's
call
right.
of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah. So that's what's happening now with VMware is, everybody's like, okay, I thought the pricing was too high, but I didn't say anything before, but now I'm going to say something and we're going to switch. Yeah. Interesting article. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, for sure. One final thing, just on kind of to your point on because we kind of hit all three in a row there. Just going back to the number 2 one around the margin shifting. Essentially, what you're
Yeah,
saying was the SaaS companies are taking margin away from banks, right? Is
that's
that
right.
is that kind of what it was?
That's right. Where the banks used to have the margin, let's say in the olden days, before the rise of technology, before the huge rise of software, now they've used software to make their businesses much more efficient, but most of the margin gain that comes from becoming more efficient, becoming more productive has gone to the software company and not stayed with the bank. Fascinating concept.
Yeah, and also I'd imagine most of the banks probably have a company running their apps and all this other, where then the bank is really just a back end function capturing a
Inception.
percent of sales in a way, right? Like a percent of like
That's right.
assets under management or whatever it is. Um,
Yep.
Not so much the somebody walking to the counter doing something there, and then they can do so much with that. That is quite interesting to see margin flow. It's also good to understand when you're talking with the software companies that maybe they are capturing additional margin elsewhere and they shouldn't be capturing it from you.
The margin shift. I like
Margin
that.
shift. Cool. Uh, so as this last part here we have, Alan, is talking a little bit more about ourselves and some of our
Yeah.
background and doing little
Yeah.
mini interviews of each other.
Yeah, that's right. I always thought it would be interesting. We should do a little bit of a slow reveal. It's they people might think they know who we are, but it's always fun in the podcasts I listen to. I always find it fascinating when somebody who gives great content and you're like, who is this guy? Who's this woman? What's their background? And then slowly over the course of the years, over the course of dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of podcasts, you start to figure out, that's who this person is. They kind of open up personally. So I thought, let's start slowly. Let's talk about some of our early formative career experiences. I always like to hear about where people got their start, especially in procurement. So, Tom, why don't you kick us off? How did you first get in? And I think you studied this in school or studied something
Yeah.
related in school, but
Supply chain
then you kind
management.
of, there we go. So it
Yeah.
fits.
So for maybe folks that are like starting out don't know if people, we still have to figure out what the who's listening to this, Alan, but we'll just give like the overview. Assume the world is listening, right? The so for me, when I was going through school, um, and looking, I was always interested more in the business side of things, right? Like how things function and like how the money flows, things of that nature. But I never really wanted to go into investment banking. I didn't want to be an accountant. And the school I studied at, I didn't apply there for this, but as you're going through that college journey, it was all right, what do I want to study? And I landed in supply chain management. And the reason I landed in supply chain management was because I was interested in just how things flowed throughout the world, and having some conversations. I chatted with different professors, like that seemed like the right fit, right? It was a more of a,
Hmm.
I was interested in efficiency, and
Yep.
efficiency is kind of where supply chain management functions, right? Like essentially the more efficient, the better for the company financially and for the customers. So that led me to, from a work standpoint, and I think maybe we'll just stop at early career here. But from a work standpoint, I had an internship that was at Tyco Electronics. So
Hmm.
Tyco. So this is the same guy. I don't
I
remember
know
what
them.
his name was, but there was the company that had,
Dennis.
huh?
Dennis somebody.
Oh
Dennis
yeah,
with a
he was,
D.
speaking
Yes.
of, yeah, he went to jail for a little bit. Um,
He went to jail.
yeah, so I never knew the guy, but he had essentially, this guy I didn't join it for this reason. It was one of the bigger companies in the area, but he had consolidated a bunch of different companies, kind of like widget manufacturers, into one. He was trying to follow the GE model of, let
Yep.
me. I think he would even say it internally to folks as I would hear the stories. Like, we want to be number one in the industry that we're in, so therefore to do that, we're going to buy up the companies that make up that industry. That was kind of their, how they were doing it. Then this guy gets, I don't know if it was fraud or tax or what it was, but he got put behind bars and they split up the company. And so that just being the background of the organization I joined, um, I went there. So I was looking for internships. This was a big company, and had the opportunity from a supply chain management standpoint, joined the procurement function.
Yeah. And
So
this
that
was in Philly, kind of Philly
this is
environs.
actually it was like Central PA. So
Central PA.
I went to
Yep.
school in Central
Like
PA.
Harrisburg.
Yeah, the Harrisburg area. So
Yeah. I visited that facility of Tyco before.
oh yeah,
I, I
yeah,
s-
yeah.
I did an RFP for them once.
Oh, did you? Yeah. So
Yep.
they had a lot. They had a lot to organize. They had like a bunch of buildings. I was like, what is going on here? But they
Yeah.
were in the
Yeah.
midst of like consolidating, moving buildings. So it was quite an interesting uh, internship. So did the summer, and then they brought me back during the winter, when I had a month off from school too. So, but there, I was essentially just learning RFPs. So, like reverse auctions, they had outside suppliers, and they were going through. This is like the beginning of, not the beginning, but like the first few years of reverse auctions,
Yeah.
and so saw, like, walk through some of those. When you're in an internship, it's always important to try and do something above and beyond. So they had this whole recycled materials thing. So I built this access database on how to track the materials. I don't think
Nice.
they ever used it, but it was, something I felt good about leaving behind.
It
Of
was a good
course,
summer experience.
yeah,
Yeah.
I was the only one that
What are
could
we gonna get
maintain
that
it.
punk kid to do? Yeah.
Yeah, I was the only
Give
one
him
that
the
could
access
maintain it.
database.
Yeah, so which was actually pretty cool. But like, I enjoyed making it. But yeah, that's like applying something I learned at school to the real world. So that was pretty cool. And then out of so just went through that, and then had a job offer from there, and which I had, honestly, I had taken. I said, like, great, but I was looking elsewhere. I was interested. I'm from the Philly area, so I was interested in coming back, and ended up getting an opportunity at an oil and gas company. So, which has since more or less been disbanded, but at the time was a Fortune 50 company. And yeah, I
Crazy.
was from there. I entered my first job, like first out of school job. I was sitting inside a refinery, like close to a flare inside the warehouse. Like, we would get there. It was like refinery
Nice.
hours. I think I was getting there at 6:30 a.m., like getting in the van to go to that spot of the refinery, because those places are huge. They're mini cities.
Yeah.
I remember the first contract I did was a gutter contract. It was like the company to help with the roofs and gutters.
Yeah.
I just remember it being the first one. It was services procurement within
That's
that
cool.
specific refinery. So Yeah, and then from there I went like within that org. I I then did some at a different refinery that they owned and kind of just supported different things. Yeah, but I mean those were my first gigs out of school.
Is this where you also ran the event hydroblasting or whatever you call it?
Yeah, I mean every
You've got several you got several fun categories that you love to talk about.
yeah, my fun categories. Yeah, I mean the
Scaffolding.
refiners are super interesting. The thing you don't realize
Oh
is you
yeah.
drive by them if you're not in like the chemical space. So most of my career was in manufacturing, moved into tech later. But within the chemical industry, like the like hydroblasting, like Alan's saying, like the high pressure like water, just shooting water or something, these things can like super dangerous if somebody's just holding, like they're like knives, these things, and now they have a
Yeah.
lot more safety features. But yeah, like hydroblasting, just turnarounds in general. So what a turnaround is when the whole entire place, sometimes parts, but it could be the whole entire place, the whole refinery or whole chemical plant. It'll shut down, and then you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of like weeks. So there's a lot of planning that goes into that. A lot of support, a lot of working with the
Yeah.
suppliers, making sure they're prepped, whether it's on the services, material, equipment side. Um, Working with the plant management, because those guys, they have a lot of responsibility. Every day one of those places is down, like assume it's millions of dollars because they just have oil flowing
Yep.
through them, and then they can't make their margin, whatever it is, off those the oil flowing through or the whatever being produced. So there's really this
Yeah.
like tight wound knit group that has to plan and support these things and
Yeah.
coordinate them.
It's like a Formula One pit stop. You know,
For sure.
you get penalized for seconds lost, days lost. So
Yeah,
it's a highly orchestrated event.
but it's not the same thing every time, right? And there's like a lot of different
Yeah.
factors that go into it, like properly turning it off, probably turning it back on. So a cool thing about that, I think, is the physical nature of it. Where for me, it was okay. I'm new. I'm a kid, and I need to understand. Like I have no idea. Like everyone I worked with, I was like the youngest person like in the whole entire refinery, because they had some versions of
That's
like
awesome.
hiring freezes, right? Because it was in refining, so I'm walking around with people 30 years, my senior, that have done it for years, like walking around, seeing the areas that will be shut off, with your hearing protection, eye protection, steel toed boots, all that stuff,
Yeah.
walking around like under pipes, just like having them explain to me, like how it works and, the things we'll be purchasing, how it'll end up going in, walking around the warehouse. You can put your hands on the things you buy, which is really a cool piece of a physical environment of procurement, like being able to put your hands on it was one of the first things that, like, the recommendation is like, just go put your hands on it. Go put your hands on it,
Yeah.
Tommy. Right? Which sounds horrible, actually,
Yes.
saying that out loud, but it was specific to like capital equipment.
Yeah. You got
So
to
there
know what it
was,
looks like and how
yeah,
big it
like you can see,
is.
right?
Yeah.
Like
How
that's
it
why it costs
works.
so
Yeah.
much, right? Look,
That's right. That's right.
so yeah, so I think for me, those were some of like the pieces that, from an educational perspective, I'd recommend anybody starting, uh, like, if to the extent you can get out into the field, if you're in one of those industries, not only does it look good for you, it's also good for you. In that you want to, like, you'll learn a lot more because everyone's always willing. And actually, I think I did a pretty good job of doing this, is like ask the questions, because when you're younger, everyone answers it for you. If you're in school, everyone's going to answer every one of your questions. You could probably call like CEOs of companies, and you may get a response. Once you're
Yeah.
older, you actually still might. You'd be surprised, but you might get it much less, especially if they think you're trying to sell something to them. But
That's right.
if you're getting a graduate degree or something of that nature, reach out. And if you're in an org, talk to folks and learn. It'll be good for you.
Yeah. Tom and I officially open up to the world here on our podcast. All our listeners, if you are under the age of 30, we'll always take your call. We'll offer any advice. You have any questions for us? We'll always answer them.
25.
Because we were there once. 25. Okay.
Yeah, but maybe 30. What
Now
about
we'll get one, not two.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Now we get 0. So
Now we'll get 0. Yes.
all
You
right,
took the
30 for
bar too
now.
low.
Maybe we'll move it down later on.
Funny. Well, I had, whereas you had a very, I'd say, interesting hands-on experience, I had less so. I mean, my start in procurement came when I joined a management consulting firm, McKinsey, and being located here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, this office of McKinsey was largely focused on a lot of different operations work. So we worked in a lot of manufacturing facilities, like the refinery you talked about. And one of the hot areas when I joined McKinsey in '96 was what we called purchasing and supply chain management. So my first engagement that I was staffed on was with a steel company, a steel and bearings company based in Ohio, and very similar experience to your Tyco experience, Tom, where I was just kind of being led along by the McKinsey, my seniors at McKinsey. We go into this relatively dingy kind of office where procurement was housed for this company. Procurement was the backwater of this company, but some really nice people that I worked with. 2 people in particular that I remember, and the first several months was spent building an Access database of all their spend. So we could basically say, okay, what do they spend the most on? What do they spend the least on? Which suppliers are the biggest suppliers or the smallest suppliers? And we use that Access database to do some segmentation and some analysis and to really direct the efforts of our team so that we could say, okay, where is the biggest bang for the buck? Where's the lowest hanging fruit? What should we be focused on? Because our mission at this client was to help them save some money through procurement. And the little bit that I remember of this very first client, we actually didn't run any RFPs. We actually rolled up our sleeves and met with, I think it was like the top 5 suppliers by dollar. And we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars spent with these suppliers. And we spent a lot of time building these elaborate supplier workshops that would last a whole week. And 6 weeks before the workshop, we would reach out to the supplier and say, hey, our client wants you to come in, spend a week with us, and we're going to collaboratively try and find ways that we can improve margin for each other, improve the way we work together, improve productivity between our 2 companies. And we expect you to bring your CEO, and we want your CFO, and we want your head of operations. We want you to bring everybody in for this meeting. It's going to be a big cross-functional meeting. And as you can imagine, this I think it was a $3 billion company at that point in time. When they called their suppliers in, their suppliers listened. So they came in wearing their suits. And we spent the better part of a week literally spreading blueprints on conference room tables saying, why does this part cost so much? That we buy $10 million worth of this part. What can we do? What are we doing? What are we engineering into the price of this thing that makes it so costly for you to do? And boy, I was kind of the young punk at the table, and my job was to be the secretary. I basically recorded everything that I heard. So, dozens upon dozens of cost savings ideas would come up on a typical day. And it was my job to get those into an Excel spreadsheet so we could figure out, okay, which ones of these are priorities, which ones of these are ideas that will really move the needle. And that was, I remember with one particular supplier being able to take on the order of 20% cost out of what they did, just because of kind of this poor communication that was going on up to that point in time between buyer and supplier. So I really firsthand saw the importance of procurement and the importance of efficiency when you sit down and start to think through and just do some basic blocking and tackling, how you can really save some money for an organization like the one we were working with. So that was a huge experience. I had a few other procurement clients that I was procurement engagements that I was staffed on with McKinsey. McKinsey had a fairly typical management consulting model where I was on the road 4 or 5 days a week, so away from home. Orlando, Florida, this lovely little backwater of Ohio, Austin, Texas, you name it, I was probably staffed there. And, after 3 years of that, it got to be a real grind. Traveling is fun at first, and then it gets old fast. So I was definitely looking to come off the road, and that led to my second opportunity, which I think probably, given our age difference, Tom, this dovetails with your first internship at Tyco you were talking about. Those reverse auctions that you guys were dabbling with at Tyco. That was the company I joined, the first company that basically introduced reverse auctions into the larger world of procurement and supply chain. There's a company called Free Markets. It was founded in 1995, but really it went public in late 99, just before the new millennium, just before 2000. And boy, that was a high flying startup. I was one of the first, I think I was employee number 150 or thereabouts. And we grew to a couple thousand people. But the whole idea behind Free Markets was bring buyers and suppliers online with this new technology called the internet, called the WWW, the World Wide Web. And what was originally called Free Markets Online changed their name to Free Markets. We would create events where we brought buyers and suppliers together online, and buyers would issue an RFP, request for proposal, that was very detailed, so that just about the only thing that was yet to be determined was price. And then we would put the suppliers head to head with each other, and they would in real time bid their price down, and they could see what other suppliers were charging, and they could respond and drop their price further. And we were able to generate just crazy amounts of single day savings in these reverse online markets. It wouldn't be uncommon to see 20% savings. I think the biggest I ever saw was 85% savings. So, it really kind of spurred those competitive juices and drove a lot of competition in different supply bases where we did our work. And certainly Tyco was one of our clients. I can remember them being one of our clients. A lot of the widgets, as you describe it, that they made were things that came out of China. They bought a lot of printed circuit boards, a lot of electronics, a lot of wire harnesses, a lot of molded plastics, a lot of sheet metal, things like that. And boy, those were all just super ripe markets for reverse online auctions. It was awesome.
Yeah, I remember later in my career, I mean, it was still the same company that I first started off with. We chatted about this before. There was then like, what else can we use it for, right? For reverse auctions. And they tried using it for services. And I'd be curious how many companies went bankrupt trying to support those, because it's also, like you said,
Yes.
the internet was new and people were kind of like it was like a game. I remember like the view of how it was, where you can see like, if you're lowest, you can let the supplier know if they're lowest or not lowest, and things of that nature. I'd be curious. Like then you start doing it for hourly rates. And really, hourly rates is such a simple mathematical equation, right? But so many folks maybe don't understand their business. There's an HBR. Did you know there's an HBR case on free markets?
On free markets, it's actually a pricing case study. Interestingly, it's not about procurement itself. It's about pricing, because our initial pricing model at free markets was one where we charged suppliers. So the guys who are actually getting their brains beat out on the screen, we charged them because we thought, the biggest barrier to big companies like Tyco engaging free markets is our cost. If we can make it free for them and the supplier pays for it, then we're in nirvana. But what we found after running hundreds and hundreds of these sorts of events, and then you'd have thousands upon thousands of suppliers that you were chasing to say, why haven't you paid my invoice? It was unsustainable. The suppliers just really didn't want to pay our fees. So somewhere about 98, I think, we had a big pricing model change, back to our Broadcom discussion. And we started charging the buyers. We started charging the Tycos of the world. And yes, that slowed down sales, but it certainly made invoice collection and revenue management and all those other things much easier, which really caused the business to take off financially. And that led us to kind of become a Wall Street darling with our IPO in late 99. And then HBR asked if they could write that article. It's a good article. It's a good article about pricing. Pricing is so important and from so many different facets. And it's a good article if anyone wants to give it a read.
Yeah, the pricing model of things, because there are some, you always have to be cautious what you're going to pass over to a supplier and if it's beneficial to them or not. Because some companies, like the companies that will help manage your contingent workforce, they'll push off, it's a percentage here, a percentage there. for free markets, you're like, yeah, you're gonna get a bunch less margin, and then you're also gonna pay us. They're like, you got to be kidding me, like,
yeah.
this is hurting twice, right?
In the best case scenario, they dragged their feet. In the worst case scenario, they like took a lighter to the invoice. We're like, forget this. We're not paying these.
Another
guys.
one's here. Just
let them come find me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll probably buy that. Cool. No, I mean that's interesting stuff. Is there any big takeaways? Like when you having worked at McKinsey and then at free markets, was there like maybe we stop with that? But were there like big takeaways that you had on that side, being first in consulting? And the good thing about consulting, I would believe, and I have friends that work at McKinsey, is like that you get to see a lot, especially early on, which I'm sure is dramatic. And then free markets, you're that big support function and just watching all these dollars flow around and changing hands. And like, what were your big takeaways, Alan, as you look at that portion of your career?
I mean, there are obviously lots of different takeaways, but focusing on the business takeaways, what you said about McKinsey was true. I got to learn a ton. I got to see a lot of different things, and that was a huge educational boon. I also built a great network of people in McKinsey and in the clients that I worked with. So that was certainly a plus. I would say one of my biggest takeaways, though, is it's difficult in management consulting to really add value for a client. So McKinsey was charging millions of dollars for each one of these engagements. And, they're a very big company, very expensive to work with. And at some point in time, I just kind of got tired where I felt like I don't feel like I'm delivering that value. It's important to me, if I promise I'm going to do something for somebody, that I follow through with it. And the equation didn't feel right. It didn't feel like our clients were getting the value that we promised. Whereas then switching over to free markets, our clients got lots of value from the work that we did. And I would say that free markets truly was, if McKinsey was my introduction to business, because I didn't have a business background, I got a PhD in chemistry. I was kind of a science guy. McKinsey was my introduction and education around business. Free markets was really my education in procurement. That's where I went to school on procurement, because learning to write those detailed RFPs that were required to run these reverse online auctions.
Yeah, because you guys are supporting them too. Like folks didn't know how to even tee them up at that time.
Oh
my
gosh.
Yeah.
And RFPs had to be the gold standard. If you didn't have a good RFP, you would have a horrible online auction. And so you spent most of your time really thinking about how to drive competition through a very tightly worded, well-worded RFP. Then you learned a lot about supply bases. You learned a lot about competition inside supply bases. And so I think that's really where most of how I think about procurement came from those early days at free markets.
Very cool. Well, Alan, I think, is that the pod?
That's the pod. Tom Finn, who puts the fin in finance, and your original OG in procurement, as we learned today, Alan Veek. We're signing off. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for joining us on the Rebuild Procurement podcast. Like and subscribe on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to stay up to date on the latest procurement content.
Show me, and you won't hear the word rebuild.